Thanks to co-presenters, really interesting projects. I'm going to be talking about data visualization and inquiry and invention in the digital humanities. So let's minimize this a little bit. There we go. I feel balanced now. And this is some work coming from like two classes that I teach, English/IMS 411, as well as a new course that I'm starting in the spring, 261 in IMS, which is a data visualization course. And I wanted to start with a little thing that I think is perfect for thinking about visualization, and especially how it can help us kind of discover things. Things that we didn't think were possible before, or things we couldn't have seen before, by asking precise questions. And this is something I just learned, so I wanted to teach everyone else about it as well. So I ask a question. This would probably be better in person, but which planet is the closest to Earth? And you can maybe think about this. Is it something you know? We often have models like this, which help us visualize the planets and have us think about, okay, where is our place in the universe, right? And if you think of these types of models, we often think of, okay, I know where Earth is. We're between Mars and Venus. You might know a little bit more and be like, oh yeah, Venus, I think is the closest planet to Earth. But these models are always hiding a lot of information as well, aren't they? They're obfuscating a lot of things. For example, we know, the Earth is not this big compared to Jupiter. We're quite a bit smaller. The sun is so massive, it's very hard to have everything kind of fit in the same line. And we also might know that, the planets aren't nicely in a line like that outside of, I don't know, cosmic events where everything lines up and like an ancient evil awakens. So we might then think of a model more like this, right? Where the planet that is closest to Earth, we're like, oh, they're in space, right? It's three-dimensional. They're moving around. They're doing a lot of stuff. And when we think about that, right, then that complicates our idea a little bit more, right? Where are we exactly? Where are we in the grand scheme of things? And then when we think about this, right, three-dimensionality, once we're visualizing this actual, more of a concept of what the planets look like, especially in relation to each other, our question gets a little bit more complicated. Which planet is the closest to Earth doesn't have a simple answer, right? Which planet is the closest for the longest time might be a more precise question, as in which one is usually closest to it, right? Which planet is the shortest average distance to Earth, as in which planet is, by and large, usually the closest to Earth. And then we might think too, which planet ever gets the closest, like who is ever our closest, although they're not always the closest, right? So luckily some guys figured this stuff out. I was perusing Physics Today, as you do, and learned about this great little bit of information where they built a visualization model to track the orbits of all of the planets in the solar system. So we not only had the planet Venus, which is often considered the closest planet to Earth. It is ever the closest, it gets the closest, but it is only sometimes the closest. And most of that other time, it is actually Mercury. And the great thing about that is they extrapolated this model out a bit further and found out that it's actually true for every other planet in the solar system. That is, Jupiter, the closest planet, usually is Mercury. Even Neptune, and yes, they even did Pluto, the closest planet is usually Mercury, because orbits are so massively huge. They are constantly putting the planets that are technically the closest sometimes, the much further away than Mercury, which has such a small orbit, it is usually the closest. So this sort of thinking blew my mind, and I hope it blows all of yours a little bit as well, but it's one of those things that visualization can help us do, where we get to the heart of a matter because it helps us think about things in a different way. It makes us maybe blow up further models that we are used to seeing and say, no, your models are wrong, and maybe you should rethink them a bit, right? So visualization creates these great models for understanding concepts, but be wary of the inertia created by them or generated by them, right? If we have a model that we kind of think of as the usual thing, how can visualization help us get past that? And this is one of those first things that I try to get my students to say, like, okay, boom, let's, think past stuff we always are used to seeing, because what are those models limiting in our view? A great one going on nowadays that we're all probably sick of is like the election maps, right? Where you have the United States with colored states for, where the red versus blue states kind of thing, right? And that model shows a lot of land, but not a lot of people, but it's still a common model that people think of, but it also obfuscates a lot of data that's actually in there. There's much better models now, and yet still all of the, news organizations are just, boom, throw up a map of, the United States and color in the states, right? And the other aspect of that is data visualization is often results oriented, especially for public facing visuals. So we're just like reporting on our data. But what I really want my students to think more about is to do data visualization as a process and a tool throughout their entire research journey, where you can visualize things continually, you can research preliminary data, you can make models and visualize things even before you have a lot of data, because you want to continually be thinking about visually how everything's coming together and connections and drawing conclusions and things like that. It helps us ask better and more precise research questions when we visualize and go back and fix up and respond to our research questions, all right? And make them more precise or different, or Philippe had a great example, right? Where you go back and say, there's a whole other question that I've discovered by visualizing that I wasn't even thinking of before, right? So I really want my students to think more of data visualization and other visualization techniques as a path to understanding. And so that leads to the two kind of sides of the coin that I'm talking about here today, inquiry and invention. So a little bit about inquiry and data visualization. Andy Kirk has this great idea of talking about the hidden thinking of data visualization. Like, again, it's not just results, but there's a ton of thinking behind the scenes when you're doing data visualization or any type of visual modeling, right? You have all this work that goes into it. It's not just a nice, cool thing at the end, but there's a lot of work that goes into that. So it's some of the basic things like, who are you visualizing for? Why are you doing it? What are your initial questions and things like that? And he has these nice stages of data visualization. But again, I think a shift is important to continually revisit visualization throughout the research process as a kind of reflective and generative process. So something that we can do all sorts of low stakes visualizing. We can do quick visualization tools. We can do pen and paper. We can do materials. It's just a lot of ways to get back to visualizing things and not just wait till we have results that we can show off. And one of the big things that has become big in data is storytelling with data. And I think it's a good term. I like it. But a lot of times it's a little reductive as like showing a process or something, right? Like, oh, we can show a story through time, or we try to mimic the arc of like the hero's journey or something, or like that, rising action and blah, 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 falling, whatever, and stories. And it's like, that's kind of limiting. I'm much more interested in research as a process of understanding. So you can do storytelling with any visual by walking the viewer through your understanding. So if you have like a journey to creating a data visualization, and I think maps are a great example, any type of long form research project like people have been showing today, is just a great way that you can walk people through any of that kind of research process and use the data visualization or other type of model to really highlight and show that story, that you're kind of hinging through it. It's not just a here's start A to B or something, but that messy journey can really be talked about through the visual as a really cool sort of linchpin for it. So I really think of storytelling more for data visualization as a way of discussing or processing your way of thinking. You can do different iterations, show the first draft, show messy things that aren't quite finished, and talk people through it. And one that comes to is a very interesting thing in rhetoric right now. There's a lot of discussion of material rhetoric and materiality. We're really thinking more about like how things, digital and otherwise, have material effects in the world. There's great research, of course, being done on things that are very important. Climate change is a great example, COVID-19, things like that, where we're trying to say, like, these aren't just abstract models, but what are they having an effect on in the world? And the humanities is a great place to, I think, work within and alongside those kinds of projects, because we care about people, and that's great, right? So one of the things I really want my students to think about is playing with data, this kind of messy process of working with data sets, collecting data, and coding it and trying to figure out and make sense of it. There's been some great work in maker spaces and skill shares. I've got a link to a few people there. I really like Lori Gree's work, Still Life with Rhetoric, talking about the visual as material entity that takes on a life of its own. She studies the Obama Hope poster and the kind of ripple effects it has out into the world. So just thinking more generally about visualizations and data as materially constructed that have material effects in the world. So design process is a multi-step process, testing, playing, iterating, reworking an idea across mediums and technologies. Constructing data, reconstructing it. You might get an open source data set, but you have to recode it or rework the data in some way to make sense of it. There's tons of government data sets that need a heck of a lot of polish before they can be turned into something useful. And my students do the work. They love doing it. Nah, but it's an important part of the work, is taking something and making sense of it, or revisiting their own data collection and going back and saying, you know what, I need to do demographic data. I need to collect more data to make sense of it all. All right. So that leads us to Invention. I wanted to show a couple of student projects from classes and some cool ways that they kind of told stories and walked through this process of data visualization. I wanted to just leave a list for people. There's a ton of tools out there for creating data visualizations. There's WYSIWYG tools. You can make some in Excel, Google Sheets. My students get handy with Adobe Illustrator so they can edit and make their visuals look really cool. There's stuff out there, Tableau, Infogram, OpenHeatMap, Voyant, stuff like that, Gephi. And then if you really want to get hardcore with it, you can start learning some libraries. The class I'm teaching next semester, we're doing Python. I like JavaScript myself because I'm a masochist, but no. But we're doing Python, I think, in the next one because it leads to data analysis. But there's a ton of stuff out there. But these have a bit more of a learning curve, right? So if you're just starting out, the WYSIWYG tools will get you somewhere. So a couple things my students do to kind of get press. Oop, I skipped one. This is fine. It's not that important. No. I'm always saying that I kind of mimic some of the strategies for writers, right? Like brainstorming and free writing and stuff like that. We do the same things with data visualization. So we collect some basic small data sets and kind of go from there. So we do sketching in class, with like demographic data from something. You have lots of this kind of just hands-on stuff in class where they're drawing things out. And this is just total free form where they're like trying to make sense of it visually so they come up with interesting things. We do some thinking with nodes. I love Manuel Lima's visual complexity. So we talk about, well, like one entity you can trace throughout the entirety of a system by doing nodes that are connected in some way. And we do it materially so they can get kind of a hands-on experience before we, sort of abstract it out with the computer tools. And then once they do all this stuff, they're ready to start working on their projects. And one of the great things is, I can think back and tell a story about these students' projects by thinking about the ways they told me how the story developed of their data. This student, he did a thing on being Airbnbs and pricing in his hometown. hometown, New York. He's from New York, right? Yeah, his small hometown. No, and walk through that. And he was doing a thing where it's really showing this problem of people being able to even afford to live in New York anymore because Airbnb is taken over. This student talking about the greatest concentration of skyscrapers and how it's really complicates those kind of old school things we hear, like developing world versus the developed world kind of stuff, and how that really is being broken down by examining where cities are being built and how people are, living in those places. I have students taking interesting things from video games and things like that, telling a story about death while using Chinese symbology of the flower petals to represent unfortunate deaths in the 20th century. And a little bit more of a humanities one, a student who visualized Dante's Inferno by tracing out where all the people were from and how Dante was just kind of taking pot shots at everyone he didn't like throughout the world and history. And really, it's all kind of coming down to that, is that, students, this process should lead to discovery and design and back again, and it's a messy, complicated sort of process. But when they get involved with it, they respond well to it. They think it's interesting. Their visuals, they have a huge story they can tell alongside it, and it gives them lots of opportunities to kind of keep coming back and iterating and making something they're really proud of at the end. So I've got some works cited, and special thanks to my awesome data viz students for the awesome work they've done. But I really want to just end there with how awesome my students are, because that's what it's all about. Thanks.